podcast της Athens Voice.
It has now been more than 3 months since Russia began its invasion in Ukraine in an event that has already affected the course of the 21st century for the foreseeable future. However, behind this bloody war there lies a history dating back hundreds of years, with the seeds of the conflict being planted centuries before even relatively recent events such as the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which further confirmed the ever-present imperialist attitudes of the Russian state. The conflict in question is as old as the history of Ukraine and the modern Russian state themselves, encompassing above all aspects of identity, politics and religion. Of all the above, it is the latter that will concern us most as we investigate the turbulent history of Orthodoxy in Ukraine and Russia, culminating in the reaction of the Moscow Patriarchate to the presentation of the Tomos of Autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church by the Ecumenical Patriarchate on October 11, 2018. Through our investigation, we shall uncover how matters of faith have been twisted in the name of political dominance. I am Konstantinos Kougas, journalist and postgraduate student in digital media, communication and journalism in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki.
And I am Nikos Tsilikidis, theologist and historical researcher, and also a postgraduate student in digital media, communication and journalism in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Before we begin, it would be useful for our audience to make an explanation of the canonical ecclesiastical terminology. What do we mean when we say that a church is autocephalous, and what do we mean when we say that it is autonomous? In the Eastern Orthodox churches, autocephaly is the status of a church whose archbishop does not report to any other prelate. When an ecumenical synod or the Patriarch of Constantinople frees an ecclesiastical province from his authority, then we say that the synod or the Patriarch grants a tome of autocephaly. Autocephaly in short means that the church granted to it by the tome of autocephaly can now lead itself. Autocephalous Orthodox churches nowadays are the Autocephalous Church of Cyprus, Greece, Poland, Albania, Czech Republic and Slovakia, and since from 2018, the Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. An intermediate stage is what we call as autonomy. The senior bishop of an autonomous church, for example the archbishop, speaks directly to the patriarch of the mother church to which he belongs, who also validates his elections. But in all other matters, the self-government applies. For example, that was the status of Ukrainian Orthodox Church until 2018. The election for Archbishop in Ukraine was directly validated from the Patriarchate of Moscow, which considered as the mother church of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine.
We shall first present a short, simplified version of the history of the region in order to lay the groundwork for the matters that will be discussed later. Our historical interest in the region dates back to the etymological roots of both Kiev and Russia, with the arrival of the tribe of the Rus in the 9th century AD. The tribe, known as Rus, is believed by most to have been Varangian in origin, migrating from Pomerania, which was located between modern-day Germany and Poland. The Rus pushed back the Turkish Khazars that ruled over the region and conquered the city of Kiev and founded the state that in the 19th century would come to be known as Kievan Rus, the state from which modern-day Russia controversially claims ancestry. Kiev would be crowned the capital of the land of the Rus, with ruling regent Oleg naming it as the mother of all Rus cities.
Our first guest is Hierodikon Kyprianos Barilo. Father Kyprianos is from Ukraine, has studied at the Theological School of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and nowadays he serves as Hierodikon at the Holy Patriarchal and Stavropeian Monastery of Latades in Thessaloniki. Father Kypriane, can you explain us, as Ukrainian and also as a member of the Orthodox clergy, how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church got the tomb of Autokefali, what did this mean for the Ukrainian people and why this action provoked the immediate reaction of Patriarchate of Moscow?
In order to understand the significance of the event of the presentation of the Tomos of Autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, it is necessary to begin with the origins of Christianity in Ukraine. I will start with the well-known historical fact of the baptism of Rus. In principle, I use this historical term without the prefix Kievan, because the name of the state of Rus was used historically in this way, and the prefix Kievan arose as a result of another escalation of Muscovy in relation to the territorial integrity of contemporary Rus. The year 1988 is considered the official beginning of the spread of Christianity among the Slavic peoples. Prince Volodymyr baptized the inhabitants of Rus, taking as a model the Christianity of the mighty state of Byzantium. The first metropolitans of Kiev were Greeks sent by Constantinople. A few years later, during the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, a Russian, that is a Ukrainian, was elected metropolitan of Kiev, whose name was Hilarion. After the Great Schism of 1054, most Slavic peoples focused on Orthodox Constantinople. In 1240, the Mongol Tatars destroyed Kiev, and the Kiev metropolitans moved their seat north to the city of Vladimir, but still called themselves metropolitans of Kiev and all Rus. From there they moved to Moscow. Constantinople decided to reorganize the Kiev metropolis and join the Lithuanian, Galician and western parts of the Kiev metropolis, and accordingly changed the title of its leader to Kiev, Galicia and all of Rus. It is quite significant that it did not include the northern territories of Moscow, which belonged to a metropolitan who was not recognized by the Patriarch of Constantinople. This metropolitan called himself Metropolitan of all Rus. Of course, the Patriarch of Constantinople rejected this metropolitan as a schismatic. In 1588, the Ecumenical Patriarch Jeremiah II visited Moscow, where in fact he was kept under house arrest. After 6 months of pressure and threats from Tsar Boris Godunov, the Patriarch agreed to recognize the autocephalous status of the Moscow Church. The year 1686 marked the beginning of the collapse of the Kiev metropolis, when it was in fact sold by civil and church authorities to the Moscow Patriarchate for money. This was expressed in the transfer of the right to ordain the Metropolitan of Kiev by the Moscow Patriarch, but this was only about the ordination of the Metropolitan in Kiev, which in turn should remain part of the Mother Church of Constantinople. Moscow rejected this act and brought a complete domination over the Kiev metropolis. Since then, difficult times of enslavement, both for state and church, have begun. It was not until the 20th century that the moment for the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine resumed. Unfortunately, this moment was not supported by any bishop, and the priest under such circumstances elected their metropolitan. Such cases had already occurred in the history of the Church.
Father Kypriane, From what you described, it is evident that the past surrounding the Orthodox Church of Ukraine has been plagued by corruption and political scheming in favor of influence, even centuries before the Soviet communist regime assumed power. However, how would the turn of the century and violent regime change in Russia affect Orthodoxy in Ukraine?
In the meanwhile, the regime in Russia has changed. It was the communist anti-Christian state in power. Those bishops and priests were usually arrested in the 1930s, deported to Siberia, or simply shot by the NKVD. An important historical event points to Moscow's unprecedented conquest of the Kievan Metropolitanate, namely the granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly to the Polish Orthodox Church in 1924 as the historical successor to the ancient Kievan Metropolitanate. It is in these documents that is emphasized that the separation of the Kievan Metropolitanate and the Orthodox Metropolitanates of Lithuania and Poland from Constantinople and the join to the Moscow Church did not take place according to the canonical rules. Its main territory was the lands of modern Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. Stalin changed his attitude to the Church and created the Russian Orthodox Church, which had the right to have a patriarch. Moreover, there were attempts pointing to the supremacy of the Moscow Patriarch over the ancient churches, in particular over the Ecumenical Patriarchate, citing various arguments incompatible with Orthodox teaching and Christian doctrine in general. This Moscow Church was under the full influence, I emphasize this, the full influence of the Communist Party. Its bishops and a large number of the clergy were KGB agents, and as we know, such a thing as former agent does not exist. After Orthodox Poland received the Tomos of the Autocephaly for its episcopate, under the influence of the same Muscovy, renounced this Tomos, and the Moscow Patriarch, again contrary to all church canons, used its so-called Tomos on Autocephaly for the Polish Church. After all, the country lost part of its territory under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In the 1980s, the jurisdiction of the so-called Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church emerged. At the same time, Patriarch Alexei II of Moscow created the so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church within the structure of the Moscow Patriarchate. This church was given board autonomy but was completely subordinate to the Russian Orthodox Church, and this can easily be seen in the statutes. At that time, the head of this Ukrainian Orthodox Church was Metropolitan Filaret, who asked for autocephaly from the Moscow Patriarch. Such a request was completely justified, as Ukraine in 1991 declared its independence as a state. Instead, the Russian Church covered its reluctance to grant autocephaly with accusation against Filaret's alleged immoral lifestyle. Orthodox ecclesiology does not know such excuses because it was about the multimillion-strong flock of Ukraine and not just about one person, its primate. As we see, the Moscow Church is not at all interested in the people and their petitions. Of course, Metropolitan Filaret denied all charges and the Russian Church removed him from power. Thus, he and two other bishops decided to join the already existing so-called Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, and thus the Kiev Patriarchate was created. Unfortunately, part of the clergy dissociated themselves from the Kiev Patriarchate and restored the so-called Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. Russia became furious and anathematized Metropolitan Filaret, who at that time had already been elected by the title of Patriarch of Kiev and all Rus Ukraine. In 2008, President Viktor Yushchenko initiated talks on obtaining autocephaly from the Mother Church of Constantinople, but was defeated by Moscow's opposition. It was only 10 years later that the fifth president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, together with representatives of the existing three branches of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, sent an appeal to the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew to provide a tomos of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Then we witnessed the very wise and absolutely canonically justified steps of the Mother Church of Constantinople.
Father Kypriané, with all due respect, we would like to interrupt you once again to explain to our audience why the Ecumenical Patriarchate is the only patriarchate which has the absolute authority to provide the tomos of autocephaly to churches around the world. Nico, can you briefly explain to us the chronicle and the reasons for this exclusive privilege of the Ecumenical Patriarchate?
To answer this question, we must move back to history and specifically to the first autocephalous Orthodox Church of Cyprus. The Church of Cyprus was founded during the first Christian years by the Apostle Barnabas, who was also its first bishop. During the Third Ecumenical Synod in Ephesus in 431 AD, for the first time in Orthodox ecclesiastical history, the right of autocephaly was granted to the Church of Cyprus with a protective character. This happened as after the death of Archbishop of Cyprus, the neighboring Patriarchate of Antioch wanting to set its own archbishop in order to fully attach the Church of Cyprus to the Patriarchate. At the Third Ecumenical Synod, therefore, it was decided to give the first tomos of autocephaly to an Orthodox Church with a direct order to the Patriarchate of Antioch to withdraw the claims for the annexation of the Church of Cyprus to the province of Antioch. Centuries after, in 1850, the Ecumenical Patriarchate granted to the Church of Greece the first tome of autocephaly with a character this time purely national. With a series of ratified decisions and practices by synods in the historical course of the Orthodox churches, the Ecumenical Patriarchate enjoys the absolute and unique right to grant a tome of autocephaly to its Orthodox Church with a national character.
Thank you very much, Nico. Father Kypriané, after our interruption, would you have the noble kindness to continue your very interesting narration of the events?
For the first time, on October 11, 2018, the Ecumenical Patriarchate annulled the decision of 1686, which essentially returned the Kiev metropolis back to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. The anathema of Metropolitan Filaret became invalid because it was imposed solely for political reasons and not for violating the teaching of the Church. Moscow, in turn, against all church canons, broke the Eucharistic communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and so did the structure of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. However, some bishops from the Moscow Patriarchate supported the desire to grant autocephaly and revealed the unprecedented pressure from Moscow against them. The episcopate of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine had enough signatures of the petition for autocephaly to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, but only 2 came to the unifying council of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Moscow found ways to persuade all other bishops not to come to the Unification Council, which took place on December 15, 2018. The head of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Metropolitan of Kiev, and all Ukraine Epiphanius, was elected at this council. And already on January 6, 2019, in the Patriarchal Church of St. George in Fanari, the Tomos of the Autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine was presented. Thus, all Orthodox parishes located on the territory of Ukraine belong canonically exclusively to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, headed by the Metropolitan of Kiev and all of Ukraine Epiphanius. All other groups, such as the so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, have no canonical basis. It is worth emphasizing that Metropolitan Onufri, who is the head of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, had the opportunity to become the head of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. As there was no ban on his candidacy. Instead, in order for the personalities of the former Metropolitan of Kiev Filaret and Metropolitan Makarios not to become a stumbling block for the representatives of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, who should join the canonical Ukrainian Church, they were removed from the list of candidates for the post of primate. Thus, all possible steps were taken to unite the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Father Kypriané, thank you for that historical presentations of the relations between the churches of Moscow and Kiev to these days. What we'd like to ask you now is about, according to your point of view, how this conflict of the churches related to what Europe experienced today.
As a result of the unwillingness and open opposition of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine to join the state-building processes, today we are experiencing the totally unprovoked and totally unjust war of Russia against Ukraine. Those who gravitate to the Moscow yoke in Ukraine, whether spiritual or political, will create the ground for escalation on the part of Moscow. And today, the whole Ukrainian people pays a high price for it. Bombs are also flying in the temples of the Moscow Patriarchate, taking the lives of children, women, the older generation, and of our defenders, the soldiers. Since February 24 the year, when Russia started this unprovoked and barbaric war, bombing not only East Ukraine but also other cities throughout the country, about 200 parishes have left the Moscow Patriarchate and joined the canonical Ukrainian Church. It is difficult to acknowledge the fact at what price this transition took place. It is essential for all the Orthodox churches to grant their recognition of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, especially during this extremely difficult time of this war. Allow me to make one conclusion. We need to understand that our internal dependence is the most dangerous, because we can seize some territory, but what can you do with it if people there do not accept it at all and continue to fight? Conversely, it is possible to have territorial independence, but people mentally depend on another political center. Winston Churchill once said that if you choose shame between war and shame, you will get both war and shame. The Russian Church in Ukraine has chosen shame, renouncing its own rights, and therefore has received both war and shame. Nevertheless, in my opinion, the tendencies are comforting, because now Ukrainians are defending their state, their culture, their church. Undoubtedly, Ukraine has already won this war, because these things for which Ukraine is fighting, and has been fighting for centuries, are an eternal value, a protection of its own, and a restoration of justice for its long-suffering people. Today, as never before, the whole world is united around Ukraine, which is evidence that despite the global economic crisis and the efforts of individual states to show their superiority through violence, the world is based on the protection of truth. This is the only right step, which is developing both morally and politically. This is what I wish to Ukraine and to Ukraine-friendly Greece.
Father Kypriané, we would like to thank you warmly for accepting our invitation and for all the interesting and enlightening information you have provided us.
Our next guest also comes from the Orthodox clergy. We would like to welcome the Archimandrite Evsevio Nakopoulo, who is serving at Metropolitan Cathedral Church of Thessaloniki, St. Grigorios Palamas, and will have the kindness to inform us about the relations of the Russian Church with the Russian state, the ecclesiastical practices followed by the Patriarchate of Moscow during its historical presence, and whether and to what extent these practices are in line with the word of gospel.
Even before the beginning of this war, but much clearer since, the Russian Orthodox Church has proven that has ceased to be Christ's Church and has become a tool in the hands of the totalitarian regime of the Kremlin. There is a constant temptation for any church to abandon the gospel of Christ and to embrace worldly ideologies. When this takes place in a church, immediately this fallen church ceases to be a church of Christ and becomes a cult whose venomous fruits are lies and death. It becomes a blasphemy against God and a plague of humanity. This is the fall of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is neither Orthodox nor Church. It is just Russian, a Russian institution in the service of the Russian state. The creed of the Russian Church is the ideology of the Russian world, a mixture of pseudoscience, racism, imperialism, revanchism, hate speech. In a few words, everything that is against the gospel of truth and love. The totally unacceptable blessing of the Russian Patriarch Kirill Gundiaev and his clergy upon the Russian genocide against Ukraine, the preaching of historical lies and of homophobic outbursts clearly proves that this is not Christ's Church anymore, but a tool in the totalitarian regime of Vladimir Putin. Why is it, after all this, that in Greece there are people who still hold that Russians are Orthodox Christians and express their support for them? Sadly, Russian propaganda, which is always rich in lies and money, has prepared the way. Many myths have been circulating accompanied by generous donations to individuals, to churches and monasteries for a long time. Let us briefly look closer to two of these myths. Firstly, the myth of the so-called Blonde Nation, which is a pseudo-prophecy written by Theoklitos Polyidis in his totally fictional work Prophecies of Agathangelos, written in the 18th century, according to which a blonde nation supposedly will help Greece and will return Constantinople to the Greeks. Of course, all this is a fable, and has nothing to do with Russia, but originally with Germany. In fact, Russia never helped Greece in its national struggles, neither under the Ottoman occupation, or during the Revolution of 1821, or after the Second World War, or even until this very day. Secondly, there is the myth of the common Orthodox faith, by which Greeks and Russians supposedly become brothers. The Russian Church always had the dream of becoming the head of the Universal Orthodox Church, pushing aside the Mother Church of all Orthodox, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, and towards this end, the Russians have worked during the past centuries, both openly and secretly, especially after the communist infiltration and occupation of the Moscow Patriarchate, when Joseph Stalin put Sergius Stragorodsky as a patriarch, totally controlled by the KGB. No room for Christian brotherhood was left, since Christianity itself was kicked out of the Moscow Patriarchate. It is remarkable that the Russian military cathedral, consecrated some years ago by the Russian Patriarch Kirill Gundiaev, has the communist hammer and sickle as its decoration everywhere, even upon the cross. The essential in Christianity is the truth of Christ, which is absolutely necessary for the establishment of justice. Only truth and justice produce love. The current situation of the Russian Church and all the other satellite churches around it is one of lack of truth and justice. How then could love proceed forth? It is impossible. What was known but hoped to be avoided all those years among inter-church relations is now open wide to the whole world. A church without the gospel and void of the fruits of the gospel. A church prostrating in front of the worldly throne of the Russian state and not before Christ. A church which blesses the current horrible genocide against Ukraine. The Russian godless church.
To understand Russia's obsession over the control of the Ukrainian Orthodox faith, we must also understand the importance of Ukraine as a state on the world of international politics. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has been assigned, for better or for worse, the role of a buffer state. As is the case with buffer states, they are often stuck in a tug-of-war for influence. It is crucial to Russia's plans to influence every aspect of Ukrainian life in order to forge a pro-Russian sentiment before assimilating the Ukrainian population both in spirit and in politics.
To help us understand the importance of buffer states in the stage of international politics, we have with us Ms. Rebecca Pedi, Associate Professor in the Department of International and European Studies at Macedonia University of Thessaloniki. Ms. Pedi, one of Russia's arguments that seeks to justify the invasion of Ukraine is the importance of buffer zones close to their borders, and for these reasons Ukraine's possible entry to NATO was seen as a threat to Russia's sovereignty. What do we mean when we refer to buffer zones in international politics?
What is the importance of buffer zones in Eastern Europe? Does Ukraine's entry to NATO really pose a threat for Russia?
The conflict between Ukraine and Russia in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, and the increasing competition between Russia and the West have revived concepts like that of the buffer state and Finlandization, which had been considered obsolete. President Macron brought it to the forefront again when he suggested that Finlandization could be a solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Buffer states appeared in the 19th century, created by European great powers in order to manage competition between them in Europe, Asia, and Africa as colonial powers. They helped to avoid direct confrontation and led to prolonged periods of peace among rival powers. Afghanistan, Belgium, Switzerland constitute examples of buffer states from that period, later joined by the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Austria and Yugoslavia. The main defining criteria for buffer states are three: location, lying between two rival powers; relative power, having limited power in comparison to the states it buffers; and foreign policy orientation, pursuing a policy of neutrality. What is crucial in this case is whether the more powerful neighboring states or blocs see the weaker in-between states as buffers, as their defense perimeter, or as parts of their sphere of influence, and also how the small states themselves as actors react to demands by their more powerful neighbors and their goals. It's true that Ukraine has been especially important to Russia for historical, economic, security and political reasons. That is why Russia did not accept Ukraine's independence easily and initially considered it abnormal or temporary. On the occasion of NATO's promise to Ukraine and Georgia for future membership, Vladimir Putin, Russia's prime minister at that time, warned NATO leaders that Russia would perceive such a development as a direct threat, and that the future of cooperation between Russia and the West will depend on whether NATO members take Russia's interests into account. Putin pointed out that millions of Russians live in Ukraine. Crimea had been given to Ukraine as a gift, and that a series of internal animosities would be exacerbated were Ukraine and Georgia to seek to join NATO. Later, Russia also securitized Ukraine's association agreement with the EU. A democratic and westernized Ukraine would constitute a bad example to Russia and other countries in the neighborhood, and that is why Russia's reaction to both the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity later was that those uprisings were instigated by the West. Ukraine is important to Russia. In 1994, Brzezinski noted that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. It is for this reason that Russia did not want to keep Ukraine neutral. Rather, it wanted to integrate Ukraine into its own CIS projects at all costs. Russia's aim was to keep Ukraine dependent on Russian gas in order to exert its influence on economic and political elites, and through them on domestic politics and foreign policy. To this end, Russia has employed a series of traditional and hybrid tools: Russification, passportization, separatism, Crimea's annexation, disinformation campaigns, and the gas price as a political weapon. Similar tools were also deployed in Georgia and Moldova. Since 2014, Russia has lost control over Ukraine, and it is in this context that we should see Russia's invasion to Ukraine.
Ms. Pedi, thank you very much for your insight on this topic. Lastly, we have the honor to speak with Alexander Sosoniuk, Ukrainian consul in Thessaloniki, who is here to discuss with us the current situation in Ukraine and in Europe.
How do you feel about the position the West has chosen to keep regarding the war?
We are thankful to the West for help and assistance, but frankly speaking, the military aid is coming not in time and in enough quantity and configuration. Today, Ukraine, which defends the security of European continent, also needs decisive military, humanitarian and financial support to stop this new global threat from Putin's Russia.
Since the beginning of the war, President Zelensky has asked for the assistance of the West in order to arm and defend the country, making it clear that Ukraine will defend its territories against Russia. How did the Ukrainian citizens react to the call for defense?
Ukrainian citizens reacted positively to the call for defense. Most people are interested in military West aid to protect themselves. Most Ukrainian people don't want to live under Russian occupation and they want to live with West, with European Union.
Regarding your country's forces, there has been a controversy when it comes to the Azov battalion. What is the truth behind the actions of the battalion? How did the Ukrainian government handle its most extremist aspects in the past?
The truth is that Azov is an official battalion of Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, has nothing with nationalism, and it was organized as a reaction on Russian military aggression in 2014. The Nazis or Russism is those who send people to concentration camps and kill millions of Jews and other so-called undesirables. Today Russians have set up so-called filtration camps for Ukrainians and are carrying out illegal deportation of over 1 million people, including up to 200,000 Ukrainian children to Russia. Russism is a new Nazism of the 21st century. That is why some countries have banned public displays of the letters V and Z, the black and orange Georgian ribbon, which are symbols of Russia's aggressive ideology. During the World War II, the Nazis killed over 10,000 civilians in Mariupol within 2 years of the occupation. Russian invaders have already killed more than 20,000 residents of Mariupol within 2 months. Now the city is almost ruined by Russian bombardments and airstrikes.
One of the basic talking points of the Kremlin regarding the invasion of Ukraine is the existence of neo-Nazi groups acting in eastern Ukraine. What is your opinion on this specific part of the Kremlin's narrative?
My opinion is that Russian propaganda makes the same like Hitler made before World War II with Sudets and Klavets operation. This point, I mean existence of neo-Nazi groups, were also the basis for Russian aggression against Ukraine. If there were some problems with neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, many involved unfriends of Ukraine cried about the evidence on every corner before the war and during the war.
How powerful as a weapon do you think Russian propaganda is when it comes to their foreign relations? How much do you think that Russian propaganda influenced and continues to influence the international public's perception?
Russian propaganda is a very powerful weapon which continues to influence the international public's perception. The clearest evidence is that Russia continues to pay a huge amount of money on propaganda even today being under the West sanctions. You can see here in Thessaloniki where some channels belong to Russians and forecast the Russian view on all international issues. The other evidence of influence of Russia propaganda is maintenance of some questions concerning Azov. Even Greek general consul in Mariupol, who came out of this city, the last from the European consuls, indirectly said in his first interview after leaving Mariupol that Azov is not about nationalism.
Mr. Consul, we would like to thank you very much for your time and for your assistance.
Under Stalin, the Patriarchate of Moscow came under the direct control of the KGB. The fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War signaled the need for a unifying ideology within Russia to revive the old power of the Russian Empire. The Kremlin and the current president of Russia recognized orthodoxy as one of the most powerful weapons of political diplomacy through which the Orthodox states could see in the face of Russia the so-called Third Rome and enjoy the protection of the Patriarchate of Moscow, which, in the end, never ceased to function as the exclusive instrument of the state, putting the national interest first against the message of the gospel. One of the strongholds of Russia in the general goal of ecclesiastical annexation of nation-states was Ukraine and its hitherto autonomous church. Its complete detachment from the Patriarchate of Moscow was supported by the Ukrainian clergy and people, resulting in Russia losing an important Orthodox pawn on its diplomatic chessboard, watching the West penetrate one of its ecclesiastical strongholds.
But the practices of the Church of Russia did not stop even after this catastrophic war. What Kremlin did in the political arena in Ukraine, the Moscow Patriarchate did in Church of Africa. In particular, without any jurisdiction, the Patriarchate of Moscow, considering that it protects the Orthodox people who are friendly to Russia, as President Putin declared that he started the invasion of Ukraine to protect Russia-speaking Ukrainians, established an exarchate within the jurisdiction of the Patriarchate of Alexandria. The motives, of course, it was obvious in all ecclesiastical cycles because this was done in response to the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the autocephaly of the Church of Ukraine and as a demonstration of the power and expansion of the influence of the Moscow Patriarchate and consequently of Russia in the African continent. The response of Patriarch of Alexandria and all Africa, Theodoros II, was direct through a circular letter he wrote to all his spiritual children in Africa on May 9, 2022, linking the act of the Patriarchate of Moscow with the autocephaly of the Church of Ukraine and characterized this action as utterly hostile to the Patriarchate of Alexandria, and it is contrary to many other canons which forbid one church from violating the borders of another. Despite the exclusion of the Patriarch of Moscow Cyril from the sixth package of EU measures against Russia, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomeos' statement regarding to the attitude of the Russian Orthodox Church on the Ukraine war was loud and clear, according to an interview that Ecumenical Patriarchate gave in ERT1 and to journalist George Kouvaras in late May.
In the words of Patriarch Bartholomeos, and I quote, "It would not be possible for all churches not to condemn violence, war. But the Russian Church disappointed us. I did not want the Church of Russia and Brother Patriarch Cyril to be this tragic exception. I do not know how he can justify himself in his conscience, how history will judge him. He had to stand tall, because one can object pressure from President Putin. He should have reacted to the invasion of Ukraine and condemned the war as all other Orthodox primates did. He did not. That is to his detriment, and I am very sorry. We may have had our differences, the most well-known for the autocephaly of the Church of Ukraine, the differences we have had for centuries now because the Russian Church is eyeing the primacy of Constantinople, undermining the foundations of the throne of Constantinople. But I was waiting for Brother Cyril in this crucial historical moment to stand up to the circumstances. If need be, to sacrifice his throne, to say Putin, Mr. President, I cannot agree with you. I resign, I leave. Would he imprison him? I do not know what President Putin would have done if the Patriarch had reacted to his plans. But that is not what we, the other prelate brothers, would expect." End quote.
We would like to thank you for your attention, as well as to thank Dimitri Karavassili and Revolver Studio in Iktinu Street, Thessaloniki for his utmost cooperation and help in creating this radio documentary. This has been Nikos Tsilikidis
and Konstantinos Kougas for the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki.
Ήταν ένα podcast από την Athens Voice. Μπορείτε να ακούσετε τα podcast της Athens Voice στο athensvoice.gr και στο Spotify, στο Apple Podcast και το Google Play Music.